Welcome back to the Catholic Buzz, episode 7. I'm Father Daniele, and joining me, as always, are my two favorites. To my left is Josh Sullivan. Josh,
Hello.
Welcome to
Thank
you
you.
today. And to my right, of course, is my personal psychiatrist, Matt Van Milligan.
Hello.
Matt, welcome to you. What's been going on? It's been a week since I've seen you. Anything exciting going on?
Weather's been pretty crazy all over the place. It's cool now, but it was pretty hot.
Got really hot, then really
Yeah.
cold.
Yeah, but it didn't. No frost. We got our garden in, so we're just kind of from here on out, no frost.
Yeah, I saw the neighbors putting in their air conditioning units and things this week because it was sweltering for a few days. And then this weekend was a little chilly and rainy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, again, my street was closed. People tried to use it, I guess, for walking. But I heard the beaches are open.
Yeah, they opened the beaches. Not only did they open the beaches, my favorite is that they opened up the backwoods camping. And so they're talking about opening up camping in the future, but they opened up camping on Crown Land and back in the bush where you can go canoeing and hiking and all this stuff. They had it, you were allowed to go for a day, you're allowed to go in, but you weren't allowed to set up tents or have a campfire. So you could walk into the bush, but you had to walk out again because you're not allowed to sleep in the bush. But now you can go. So we've actually got a canoe trip planned, ready to go. It's
Nice.
exciting. First time we're going to bring 4 boys, the dog, and my wife. My wife's first time on a big canoe trip, and the dogs. So this is going to be interesting all around.
That's amazing. This past weekend, there was a few things happening around the Catholic community as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know the Pro-Cathedral of the Assumption in North Bay had sort of like a takeout chili event, where you can go pick up some chili and a cookie. A good turnout, I guess, for that event. In the parking lot, of course. You can't go into the church. And then the church in our neighboring diocese, a town over in Powassan, had sort of Vespers, evening prayer on Saturday night before Pentecost.
And adoration, I think, too, right?
And adoration.
They had built an altar, from what my understanding. I heard and saw pictures and stuff. They built an altar, and people pulled up in their cars, and they were able to do that, which is kind of from like Ontario government allowing people to do very specific things. I mean, it's unfortunate that we can't have mass because you're not allowed to go car to car. You're not allowed to distribute or collect anything from those cars. You can only have 5 people outside their cars. All those little things kind of just stop us from being able to do mass, a parking lot mass, let's say.
It's true, because as things are reopening, I know I'm getting the question a lot, when are our churches reopening?
Yeah,
you know? I know someone stopped me in the store the other day and said, if I can see you here at the store, how come I can't see you at church? And it's a valid question.
Yeah.
But like our bishop at this time has not given us permission to do those things. But I know for a fact the provincial government has reached out to clergy, reached out to different priests, and I'm assuming the bishops, about sort of how to go about reopening our churches safely, right? So it's moving along.
We suffer from a very specific, whereas in the Protestant churches, they have their service. And so you can have people playing music on a stage, and then you can have someone speak from a stage. You can organize all the sound system you want and everything else so people can hear it in their cars. You can do all that. But for us, we celebrate Mass. And so one of the main parts of Mass is receiving the Eucharist. And so having people in a parking lot unless they can receive communion, I mean, it's going to be very similar to watching it on TV, right? I mean, watching it on the broadcast. And so there's no difference with going, so we got to solve that problem. That's the big one.
That's
So I'm
the big
glad
one.
the government's looking into that.
You're either stuck in your car right now watching Mass from afar, or you're stuck in your living room watching
Mass from afar.
Mass from afar, but on your TV screen. Anyways, that's not what we're talking about today, even though we all got worked up about it. I'm excited for this conversation we're going to have today because it's a question we get a lot about suffering. And why do we suffer? Why does God allow suffering? Why do good people suffer? We're doing our best to live the Christian way. And this suffering sort of clouds our existence here. People struggle with that a lot. And I find in our current life and our current climate especially, we don't like to suffer at all. Like even minor inconveniences become major catastrophes in our lives. So that's what we're tackling today, suffering. You both can relate to suffering because you spend so much time with me. But we are going to tackle the question. So where do you want to start with this?
I think we look at today. I think the good part is to start with today and how we look at suffering today versus maybe how they would have experienced suffering years ago or even 50, 100 years, 200, 300 years ago. Because if we look today, I know that when I watch commercials, pretty much every commercial I've ever watched is geared towards alleviating my suffering, right? My perfect shave, my perfect shave, and like everything. Like, oh, you have a sore back, you have allergy symptoms, you have this, that, like everything. Oh, your car is not quite right, your house is not quite right. Let's alleviate the suffering and make it non-existent anymore. And so I think that's the culture that we're growing up in, but also that's the message that's being passed to us 24/7 is don't suffer. Right? And so, but as a church, we look at suffering, and suffering can be a good thing, right? And not that it never feels good, and it doesn't matter. There's a whole bunch of different types of suffering I think we have to come out with and saying. And when people say, oh, that's God's plan for suffering, there's his permissive will, there is his perfect will. His perfect will was never, his perfect will was he created humans. His perfect will was never to have to send Jesus to the world when he created humans, but he allowed us to have self-control, freedom, and because of that, things happened.
That's a good way, I think, of a good place to start. I think first and foremost, it's okay to say God doesn't watch us from afar and say, I think I'm going to make Matt suffer today, right? Or I think it's time this person suffers and sends suffering their way or bad things. I think that's really important to clear up because I think the language people use is very important and telling of what they believe, right? Because people believe that, oh, why has God given this to me? Or why has God done this to my family? Or like you said, there's varying degrees of suffering. So I think that's really important language to use.
If you look at the Old Testament, it appears, and I think this is where some of our mentality comes from, the Old Testament, suffering was God's way of punishing the people for going off track. Does that make sense? God put them in the desert, and so like our mentality of suffering was like almost like God with lightning, Zeus with lightning bolts kind of thing, just like, oh, he did something wrong, let's hit him with suffering, Very, unfortunately, not necessarily the right approach, I don't think, the perfect approach of looking at what God was doing. What happened every time the people did suffer, though, was that they did turn back to God, and they did start to pray, and God was able to bless and reward them because of it.
Even in the Old Testament examples, I think using the language of permissive, of God is permitting suffering. The book of Job is a good example that it's like, it's not God afflicting this man with all of these, ailments and misfortunes in the hope that he'll curse me if I make this suffering severe enough. That is, no, he's permitting these things to happen from other agents. And then the Israelites in the desert, even coming into the New Testament, you have John the Baptist is like a shirt of camel hair and a diet of locusts. So like he's already kind of voluntarily rejecting this culture of kind of comfort and convenience, and I think as people of faith we can adopt not a pathology that suffering is good, but this idea that a certain measure of restraint and as Christians, and certainly the rest of John the Baptist's life attests to this as well, we can expect a reasonable amount of kind of suffering, or that there are versions of the gospel that have been packaged in a way that says, okay, no, once you've accepted Christ, your life is a vacation in Hawaii. That like looking at the early church, the early Christian martyrs, that for them, in many cases, choosing Christianity was choosing martyrdom, choosing a life of suffering.
Because that's what people, I think, say a lot, is why would I believe in a God that allows me to suffer this way? Or what is my faith doing for me right now to help me in the problem I'm having? And so, I think that's really good, because the early Christians knew what they were signing up for, this sort of thing. Yeah. They knew that the faith they were following, Remember, for the first 300 years or whatever it was, short of 300 years, Christianity was illegal.
Yeah.
So they knew that following Christ would come with a whole bunch of hardships and difficulties, but yet they did it anyways because they loved God so much. They followed Jesus. They were convicted that this was the truth. But today, lots of people who maybe have left the faith, who are disenfranchised with the church, perhaps say, God has done nothing for me except cause hardship. Why would I even stick around? Why would I praise and worship and love him?
Yeah, for sure. I was going to say, I like, if you knew that you were going to be sent to go play with the lions, like, would you? That's what the reality was. They're going to bust into your house. They're going to grab you. They're going to send you to play with the lions. Right? That was their what their lives were if they accepted Christ. Versus now, it's like, well, if I accepted Christ, I mean, I talk about it because growing up, talking about the prosperity gospel. If you do things right, and God will reward you for it, and if you do things wrong, God punish. Oh, you're sick. You must have done something wrong for God. You know what I mean? Or if you're multimillionaires because you did things right, because God's rewarding you. It's not necessarily the case, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a widespread understanding, though.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem. If we go,
Yeah.
if we go right back to sort of the basic problem of our Christian faith, is there's just so many misunderstandings of the Christian faith. So you're right. I'm doing well in life. God is honoring me,
blessing me
because I'm doing well. Something horrible is happening to me. It's because I've sinned against God, or I've turned my back. That's not what we believe.
No.
At all.
No.
And so maybe
Christianity is not karma. There isn't this sort of like one-to-one
You're
correspondence of I've done something bad, I can expect that to be repaid immediately.
I never thought about that. Karma is the perfect word for that. That is that the prosperity gospel is kind of like a karma related way. God's blessing me because I've done good, I've done wrong, so I'm getting punished.
And like there is some sympathy with that as well. That like when you're in the midst of suffering, you want to understand why. You want to reach for some sort of explanation or understanding of like, why is this happening to me? Why is this even allowed to happen in the first place? And I think that we can take the example of Christ, like why do bad things happen to good people? Looking at the life of Christ, like the worst thing possible happened to the best person that's ever lived. So we can take that example, and that kind of really reorients our expectations of whether or not.
And looking at the person of Jesus, for sure, I think it's really important to talk about redemptive suffering, right? That's the story of Jesus. I like what you said. The worst thing possible happened to the best person ever. And what came from that, though? What came from it? It came from this redemption of almost all of humanity, right? All of us have been redeemed through the precious blood of Christ. And that's, I think, a side of suffering that we don't like to talk about. We like to talk about Jesus's redemptive suffering. We don't like to talk about our own, right? Now, that being said, no one likes to suffer.
Yeah, no.
We're not saying suffering is great and fantastic and God bless you for suffering, right? But there is, I think, a real importance that we can place on uniting our suffering with Jesus. Sometimes people say that as an easy way out of suffering, right? Someone who's going through a real hard illness or a really hard place, going through a hard time in their life, you tell them to unite their sufferings to Christ. They almost say like, oh, it's something you just say, right? So someone's going through something intense. How can they unite their sufferings with Christ in a way that
is good? Okay, well, I've had a little bit of suffering in my life before. And from losing my mom at an early age to, so there's different kinds of suffering. I think that's something that also people have to realize, right? And that every person's suffering is different. So losing my mom at an early age affected me, but it doesn't affect someone as losing my father at an early age if I was to do that. It was not the same necessarily, or the same relationship, as well as financially struggling is a different kind of struggle from losing a loved one, or losing a child would be a different struggle. Like struggling and suffering is different in all different aspects, right? But I think when we talk, when it comes down to it, suffering without Jesus is still suffering, right? So you're still going to have it. Like, so let's use losing a loved one. You lost a loved one. That still happened, and you're still going to have to get through that. But suffering with Jesus can give you an amazing amount. First of all, can give you comfort through turning to him and leaning on him, giving him your burden of suffering while you get through it, but also can have such an amazing impact and in the future. God always takes the worst of suffering, and if you turn it over and you give it to him, he takes something that's so imperfect and so hurtful and can turn it into something that's amazing and beautiful. And so taking that suffering that you're suffering with and giving it over, he can take that. And someone asked me that before, and I said, I don't know how God's going to do that. You know, we don't have the answers for that. But in looking at it, someone asked me a while ago about they had unfortunate things happen in their childhood, and it really affected their life. And it said, so like why did this happen to me as an early age? I was an innocent child and all that other stuff. How come God let this happen? And there's no answer for that. Like that's bad, that's wrong, and I'm sorry for that. However, them turning it over to God and working through the suffering with God and through God, now that person is able to work with multiple other teenagers that are unfortunately dealing with something that's similar, but can work through it and say, listen, this is the way to get through. Like they're a beacon and a light for other people because they've gone through the journey and they did it right and they were able to turn their suffering over. God's using their suffering as an amazing gift to humanity to work these other people through the similar circumstances or whatever, but just to give a different view on life. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's amazing how if you turn that over, God can use your suffering to be an amazing witness to other people.
Yeah. And I think just to echo what you're saying, that one of the big problems with suffering is that in the moment of suffering, you're seeing your suffering through the lens of your own suffering. Mm-hmm. That someone can say to you, like, look at the example of Christ, unite your suffering to the suffering of Christ. In the moment of suffering, you're not particularly well disposed to do that. Yeah. Which is why, like, the importance of community, having people who have gone through similar experiences, similar losses, can help you kind of zoom out mm-hmm. from the immediacy of your suffering. That it's easy to talk about these things in kind of an abstract, kind of theoretical way. I mean, like, okay, suffering, there are spiritual goods that you can result from suffering, and but I think at the heart of it, as a community, we're really called to walk with those who are suffering and be patient.
Yeah, there's a certain community aspect of suffering too that I think you're both touching on, that we can share our own experiences with one another to help alleviate some of the pain that we're going through, right? Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes when someone suffers, we don't know what to say. Mm-hmm. We don't know how to approach them. We don't know how to support them. And then the person who is suffering sort of isolates themselves mm-hmm. from everyone because they feel like no one knows what I'm going through. And then people on the outside don't know what to do to help that person. So there becomes this divide. But I think there's a real community aspect of supporting one another through our suffering that could be a real journey to help one another on both sides of that.
I remember, so growing up, we were really close with a family called the Conrad family. And so we grew up with their family pretty close. My mom used to watch their kids, and my dad and Mr. Conrad would go and do a guys' night type thing, men's whatever. And so we got really close with the kids. Now, Ken Conrad had lost his wife early on, his first wife, and then they got married and had a lot more kids. But he lost his first kid early on. One of the biggest reliefs to me, I remember standing in the assembly line when my mom passed away, and everybody came up, oh, I'm so sorry. It felt like you more had to be a rock during the suffering. Like, this is my mom I lost, but you almost had to stand there and let people cry on your shoulders so that you could get through it. You know what I mean? I remember, so, and what do you say? Sorry for going, oh, I'm sorry, okay. But people have to express that sorrowful. I remember Ken Conrad coming through the line, and Mr. Conrad, as I know. And he came through the line, and he had lost his wife, and he had 4 kids that had no mom at that time, and and so he had been through what we were going through. And I remember him coming through, and Mr. Conrad is a man of few words anyways, but he looked, I remember him coming down the assembly line, and he just looked at me, and he just gave a head bob. And that, like, to me was, there are no words I can say, but I've been there, and you know what I mean? And to me, I almost broke down crying right there. I was fine throughout the rest of that part, but like anybody came up to me, but at that point I went, holy crud, this guy actually knows what we're going through. This guy actually knows. And that brought me so much comfort. And he didn't say anything. He couldn't say anything. He knew he couldn't say anything to make me feel better or anything. He just kind of gave me a head bob. And that was just like this sucks, And in that time, the relief that I felt, that's where almost the tears came from, was the relief that I felt that someone else knew my pain, And so sharing in that suffering is a way of helping alleviate, just realizing. And like I said, like every suffering's a little different, but there are pieces of the puzzle that all kind of fit together.
Yeah, and knowing that someone else knows the pain you're going through. I mean, that's what we get that from people in our friends circles, in our parish communities, in our community at large. But also that's the relationship we have with God too. God knows our suffering. God knows what we're going through. God knows the pain we're enduring, right? Yeah. And so the same thing, we rely on him for the grace to continue on, the hope we have to continue to sort of endure, or persevere rather, I should say, through some sort of suffering. I have a question for you. Did we already touch on this maybe? This is the number one question we get all the time. Why do bad things happen to good people? Who wants to touch that?
Okay, go for it, Matt.
Okay, here goes. So I think, when people ask that question, they're talking about kind of like a putative justice, like what we touched on really, really quickly before, that we want this kind of one-to-one correspondence to be like the good thing that we do should result in a good outcome. The bad thing we should
Karma.
Well, actually, and that may not even be the case, because like we want a good reward for good behavior, but when we do something bad, we're not necessarily lining up for the consequence.
Right.
We still own credit cards. I think that actually does come into our expectations of immediate justice. That sometimes when we feel we're the victim of kind of a natural evil, or even something committed against us by another person, we want retribution for that kind of right away. And that, I think, in a similar way with the kind of direct suffering, God is playing a long game with justice, that we want to see the fruit of all of our suffering right away. We want to be on the other end of it right away. We want to see the value of something that we just don't understand, something that happened that we have no real explanation for. We want to see the good outcome of that right away. But going back to Scripture, going back to the history of the church, like the Israelites were in the desert for 40 years. Moses didn't even get to see the promised land. Yeah. That it's like and human history is full of examples of people don't really see kind of the spiritual and material goods that can result from.
And that's maybe what we're dealing with today in 2020, right?
Immediate results.
Yeah. No one likes to suffer at all. But it's almost like the culture that we live in, right? Like, I look at people's online presence as a sort of window into their lives, right? We post the best pictures of ourselves. We want to present ourselves a different way. And then all to sort of mask maybe what's going on inside. Or perhaps we're a little unsure of revealing our true self to people. And there's tons of suffering going on within, right? There's a sort of mental suffering and spiritual suffering, physical suffering, all those things that are going on. And we're sort of told by the things we watch or the things we experience or the way people talk, the language people use, that's not okay. That we shouldn't be suffering. We should be feeling great all the time. We know that's not the real situation. We know that. Anyone with a heart and a soul knows that life is not perfect, right? So that's, I think, where you get into people sort of doing anything they can to alleviate some of the suffering, whether it be medication or illegal drugs or
Even running away.
avoiding,
Exactly.
Any kind of
avoiding,
escapism.
you know, yeah,
escaping
exactly.
things. Yeah, absolutely. So that's our. Would you agree that that's sort of our situation today? That because it's clear we're looking at people from the scriptures, we're looking at people in the early church, we're looking at people you mentioned 300-400 years ago.
Yeah.
Today, this question of suffering just doesn't resonate with people, doesn't sit well with people. Why do we have to suffer? It doesn't make sense if God loves us so much. It could be a product of the culture we're living in.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, for sure.
certainly.
I think 100%. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
I think that's where, like, yeah. I think that's what it is.
Yeah,
That's all. I can't
and
agree
like
with more.
how many of our resources are invested into avoiding, facing the realities of death and suffering?
Yeah.
That it's pharmaceuticals, drugs, entertainment. Like there are tons of things, kind of like really forcing us to avoid that issue. And again, looking at the early church human history, but like even in our current world, like other places of the world, like death is a much more prevalent reality for a lot of people than it is for kind of Western.
We did a couple years ago. Matt was on my team of guys that did Exodus 90 together, and it was one of the times that I realized. So Exodus 90 basically was you took on a bunch of, I want to say penances, but not really. It was just a bunch of things like you didn't watch TV, you didn't drink any alcohol, you didn't have snacks, you only ate your 3 meals a day, and you took on this thing, and it was all shaped around being a man and being a
And
better
to better your spiritual life.
Yeah, exactly. And what I didn't think it was going to like do a lot for me at the time, to be honest with you. The cold showers and that kind of thing. You didn't have a hot shower, you had a cold shower, or not cold, but like not hot, which is a problem. But things like that you did, and it was a great program. I don't know if I'd ever do it again, but it was great for the time. You do it for 90 days. I learned quickly on that I used TV, I used music, I did that to distract myself. And I used it to distract myself from certain things I was feeling and the suffering that I was feeling personally. And that was just more emotional suffering. And by taking away, I was using, so like you use drugs, you use alcohol, you use TV, you use food, you use whatever the case may be. I was using TV and food. And by taking all away those distractions, I had to deal with the problem that was there. I had to kind of sit down and go, okay, what is this? And then pray through it and walk through it and talk to people about it and get through it and then realize, okay, this is... So now I still watch TV. I still enjoy my food, but I dealt with the problem first because the problem was still going to be there. The suffering was going to be there, but now the suffering, if it's there, I've handled it differently. So now if something like that was bothering me again, I offer it up. I give it back over to God, and I say, here, take this suffering, do something good with it. You know what I mean? I think right now I heard 2 things that I want to just bring up. Priest told me one time, don't ask to take suffering away, but ask God for the grace to remain faithful during the suffering and to show you the lessons that He wants, or that you can, not that He wants you to learn, but you can learn through this suffering. A wise man, one of the verses I read somewhere, and I don't know if it's Christian or not, but like a wise man, a fool, the difference between a wise man and a fool, a wise man has been through a lot. And not a lot of good things, but a lot of, tough places. And because of that, they're so wise because of the tough places that they've been in. Whereas a fool, has lived life without anything, without any problems. And so not to be wise, but to be an influence on other people, to be able to say you have experience in that area and stuff like that. Take your suffering and say, God, instead of saying, take this away from me. I mean, hopefully He will, but use the words of Christ in the garden, right? Like, not my will, but yours. Like, take this cup away from me, but not my will, but yours. Yeah. And so...
Yeah, and I think that's very important to remain close to Christ, even in our suffering. We're tempted to move away from Him.
Yeah.
That's when we find sort of hope and the strength to persevere. Stay close to people you love that can support you, and I think it's really important to be kind to yourself too. when you're suffering, right? I think we just want a fast fix all the time, but like you said, Josh, sometimes it takes a little more effort to delve deep into some other things, right, that we're sort of dealing with. And to know that God doesn't impose this suffering on us, but
He allows
He is present with us during our suffering. And I think that changes our perspective. This was a heavy sort of topic today. Hey? It was very heavy, but I'm glad we addressed it because it's very important to talk about. Lots of people ask questions about it. I think we touched on a wide spectrum of things.
We could go on for hours about suffering, I think.
And
different areas
the
of
problem of suffering and all those different things. So I hope at least we've touched the surface on some of the topics of suffering. If there's things you're not sure of, please send us an email at thecatholicbuzzpodcast@gmail.com if you want us to continue the conversation on this topic. And I think it's important to know before we leave that if people are suffering, that there is a real strength in asking people to pray for you,
100%.
asking the Lord to guide you through this suffering, and not refusing help.
No.
Letting people really be strong, be present, and to be strong for you if you can't be at that time.
And you're never going to see necessarily the good outcome of your suffering while you're suffering. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah.
I can see now, years later, where some good has come from suffering that has happened in my life. But I can never, during that time, and I remember talking and even writing it down in a journal, I don't understand this, I don't see this, but then just having the faith and having I offer it back up. Years later, I look over that and go, oh, that's why that happened. Oh, that's why that happened. Look at the blessings that came from it, from being, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But questioning it at that time, you're never going to see the good that comes out of it at the time.
Yeah, and we'll never see, I guess the period of time that we suffer here on earth is small in comparison to the eternity we spend with our Lord forever. But we're way past our time for today. So thank you for joining us on this episode of the Catholic Buzz. For Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, I'm Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on the Catholic Buzz.